All right, so want to take your photography up a notch, right? We all get to that point where that little green box, that auto setting, it just doesn't quite cut it. So in this deep dive, we're going to give you like a cheat sheet for unlocking your camera's potential. We're talking about those semi-auto modes.
Yeah,
Using those.
the semi-auto modes.
We're taking a document and it's all about these different modes, aperture priority, shutter priority, all that good stuff. And we're going to turn this into something that you can actually use when you're out there taking pictures. We'll be your guides, helping you decipher all the tech jargon.
And the cool thing is you don't have to be like a total camera geek to figure these modes out. What we're going to discover in this deep dive is it's not just about, all the settings and numbers. It's about giving you the control to bring your creative vision to life in your photographs.
Yeah, totally. I remember when I first started messing around with these modes, I was like, finally, I'm speaking the same language as my camera. I can tell it what to do for once.
It's that control that just opens up a world of possibilities. You're not stuck with whatever the camera thinks a good photo is anymore.
Right.
You're the one making the decisions. You're the artist.
I like that because this document actually uses a really good analogy. It says that going beyond auto can seem kind of scary, but these semi-auto modes, they're like training wheels.
Yeah.
You get that balance of control and assistance, and it lets you focus on the creative part while the camera handles some of the technical stuff.
And that's super important, especially when you're still wrapping your head around stuff like aperture and shutter speed. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't hop on a bike for the first time and try to do jumps and tricks right away.
No way.
These modes are like building those skills.
Yeah, exactly. So before we dive into each mode in detail, let's break down some of these terms. We've got manual mode, which is the ultimate goal, right? But then we've also got aperture priority. You might see it as A or AV on your camera.
Right.
Shutter priority, that's S, or TV and program mode, which is usually just
Yeah. And each of these modes focuses on a different part of the whole photography thing. Aperture priority, for example, that's how you control the depth of field. That's what gives you that nice blurry background.
Right, like in that example in the document, the photo of the bird with the nice blurry background. It wouldn't have been the same if the background was all distracting.
Not at all.
Yeah.
That's a great example of how aperture priority lets you set the mood, the whole story of the photo, just by changing what's in focus.
Okay.
Huge for portraits, close-ups, anything where you want to really make something stand out.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, on the other hand, we have shutter priority. So if aperture priority is all about the look of the photo, shutter priority, that's about capturing motion, right?
Yeah, it's like controlling time,
Okay.
freezing a moment or letting it flow. Imagine getting that perfect shot of a hummingbird's wings frozen in midair,
Wow.
or blurring a waterfall so it looks all silky smooth. That's shutter priority for you.
I'm already seeing how I can use these. But when you talk about prioritizing aperture or shutter speed, it almost sounds like we're giving up control in other areas. Is that how it works?
That's a great question. And this is where the document gets really interesting. It talks about how even when you're focusing on one thing, you can still adjust the overall exposure of the photo. It's called exposure compensation.
Exposure compensation. Okay, now we're getting a little technical.
It's important though.
Okay.
Think of it like fine-tuning the camera's choices. Let's say you're using aperture priority for that blurry background, but the photo's a little dark. You can tell the camera to brighten it up a bit. Or if you want it moodier, you could do that too.
So even though the camera's doing some of the work, I still have the final say.
Exactly. And the best part is you can use exposure compensation with all the semi-auto modes. Gives you that extra bit of control no matter what you're shooting.
This is making so much more sense to me now. But before we get too far ahead, let's go back to those individual modes. I'm really curious about when each one is the best to use.
Absolutely. Let's start with aperture priority since we were talking about it. It's great for beginners and pros alike.
Okay.
We'll dive into why.
Let's do it. Blurry backgrounds, here we come.
Yeah.
Okay, aperture priority, all about that blur, right? But it's gotta be more than just making the background blurry.
You know it.
Yeah.
It's like this, our eyes naturally go to whatever's in focus. With aperture priority, you're controlling that depth of field. You're basically choosing what the viewer sees first.
Okay.
And the document actually mentions that even professional photographers use aperture priority all the time. People think pros only shoot in manual, but that's not true.
Really?
Yeah. Like say you're taking portraits, we want that nice blurry background so your subject really stands out. Aperture priority is what you'd use. Choose a wide aperture that's a low f number like f2.8. Get your shot set up and the camera does the rest.
So I can focus on posing and stuff and know that the technical stuff is taken care of?
Exactly. And don't forget about that exposure compensation we talked about. Even though the camera's deciding the shutter speed, you can still make it brighter or darker if you need to. Say you're taking a picture of someone and the light behind them is really bright.
Yeah.
You can use that exposure compensation to make sure they're still lit well.
Like having a personal lighting assistant.
Right.
I am loving Aperture Priority already. But we got to talk about Shutter Priority too. We touched on it earlier, but when is it like the best choice?
Shutter Priority is all about time. Deciding how motion looks in your picture. Think about sports photography. Imagine you're taking a picture of a bike race. Do you want to freeze the action? Like you can see every detail.
Or would you want to have a little blur to show how fast they're going?
Right. You could use a really fast shutter speed, like 11,000 a second or even faster, to freeze everything. But if you want that motion blur, you'd use a slower speed, like maybe 1/60 of a second.
So I can change how the whole picture feels just by changing the shutter speed? That's so cool. But I'm guessing there are times when I wouldn't want to use Shutter Priority.
There are. Remember how we said the camera prioritizes the shutter speed you set? Well, to do that, it has to adjust the aperture sometimes.
So I might not have as much control over that blurry background?
Yeah. The guide actually gives an example of this. Imagine you're at a soccer game and you want to freeze the action. So you're using shutter priority. But because it needs a lot of light to use a fast shutter speed, it might choose a really wide aperture. And that can make the background super blurry.
So even though I got the action shot, the background is too blurry to even see where the players are.
Exactly. That's when you might want to use aperture priority or even switch to manual mode. It all depends on what you want the photo to look like.
Okay, that makes sense. I can see that happening. There's so much overlap between the modes. How do you know which one to use?
That's photography for you. It's about knowing what your tools can do and making choices based on what you want to create. Sometimes you just have to try things out.
Yeah.
And speaking of trying things out, that's where program mode comes in.
Program mode, I'll be honest, I haven't really used that one much. It's like, it's not auto, but it's not fully manual either.
And yet, that's where it really shines.
Yeah.
It's like your camera's giving you suggestions.
Okay.
It's saying, hey, based on the light and everything, I think these settings will look good, but you can change them if you want.
So it's like a co-pilot that is also like a photography teacher.
Yeah. You can see what the camera's thinking and then change it if you want to.
Okay.
Like if you want a faster shutter speed to freeze the action more, you can do that. Or if you want to mess around with the aperture to change the background blur, go for it.
And this all helps you get ready to use manual mode, right?
Totally. Program mode helps you understand how everything works together. You're not just changing numbers, you're actually seeing what happens in your pictures.
Like practice before the big game.
Exactly. It's a great way to get comfortable before you go full manual.
I like it. Okay, but speaking of manual mode, we can't finish this deep dive without talking about the big M on the top.
Manual mode. The final boss of photography. It's normal to be a little scared of it, but think about everything we just talked about.
Right. Aperture priority, shutter priority. We even made friends with program mode. We basically have like photography superpowers now.
Exactly. You get it now.
Yeah.
You understand how it all works. Think of it like this. You wouldn't go to a pottery class and expect to make a perfect vase on the first try, right?
Yeah.
You start with the basics, you learn how to use the wheel, and then you get better over time. Manual mode is the same way.
So instead of freaking out when I see all those settings, I should just think of it as a fun challenge.
Exactly. It's about exploring and trying new things. And you know those aha moments we talked about. You get a lot of those in manual mode.
I bet. So instead of being scared of the M, we should be excited about it.
For sure.
But even though we've leveled up to manual mode, we don't have to forget about the other modes, right?
No way. Even pros use different modes depending on what they're doing. Sometimes you need aperture priority to work quickly. Sometimes you need the control of manual.
So it's all about using the best tool for the job. This has been amazing. We went from being totally lost with all the camera settings to understanding how each mode can help us take better pictures.
That's what we wanted you to get out of this. You're not just taking pictures anymore. You're making choices about how you want to capture the world.
Right.
So here's something to think about. What stories do you want to tell with your photos? How do you want people to feel when they see them?
Ooh, that's deep. I like it. So if you love those photos with the blurry backgrounds, Aperture Priority is your go-to. Want to capture things in motion? Shutter Priority is your friend. And if you're ready to experiment and see what you can really do, manual mode is calling your name.
Just get out there, try new things, and most importantly, have fun.
And we'll be back next time with another deep dive into something new. Until then, happy shooting.